She was 23. He was 63. Everyone judged them until she told the real story. The click of the ceramic cup against the saucer was the only sound she allowed herself to make. It was a small, sharp tremor in the otherwise placid hum of the Parisian. Café Alara kept her eyes fixed on the milky swirl in her coffee, a miniature galaxy of tan and white. She could feel the stares, of course. They were like tiny, persistent insects crawling on her skin. She didn't need to look up to see the whispers, the nudges, the sideways glances at her hand resting near his on the marble tabletop. Her hand, 23 years old, smooth-skinned and unadorned except for the cello calluses on her fingertips. His hand, 63, a roadmap of raised veins and liver spots. The knuckles, swollen slightly with arthritis. A shadow fell across their table. Alara's stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. "Excuse me," a voice said, dripping with the kind of saccharine venom only a young woman aiming for maximum public humiliation could muster. Alara looked up. The girl couldn't have been much older than her. She stood with her friends, a tribunal of glossy lips and designer handbags, their faces alight with righteous indignation. "I just have to say," the girl continued, her voice rising to carry through the cafe, "it's absolutely disgusting." Heads turned. The gentle murmur of conversations died. Arthur beside her didn't move. He continued to gaze out the window at the rain-slicked boulevard, his posture one of serene, almost regal indifference. He had perfected that look over the past year. The girl took his silence as an invitation. "For an old man like you to be parading around with her? Don't you have any shame? And you," she spat, her eyes locking onto Ilara's, "I hope his money keeps you warm at night. It's pathetic." The word hung in the air, thick and ugly. Pathetic. Ilara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a furious, helpless blush. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and hurl her coffee in the girl's smug face. She wanted to tell her everything, to peel back the skin of their story and show her the raw, bleeding truth of it. The truth that was so much darker and more complex than a simple transaction of youth for wealth. But she said nothing. She only tightened her grip on the cup, the heat a dull, grounding pain in her palm. Arthur's hand, his old wrinkled hand, moved then. It didn't reach for hers, didn't offer a comforting touch. It simply turned over, palm up on the table, an offering, a question, silent reminder of the pact they had made. Ilara met his. Gaze, his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were not angry. They were not ashamed. They were filled with a deep, weary sorrow that she knew mirrored her own. In that shared look, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. Do we tell them? Do we ever tell them? She took a slow, steadying breath, the smell of burnt sugar and wet pavement filling her lungs. She looked back at the girl, whose triumphant smirk was already beginning to falter in the face of their unnerving stillness. Ilara held her gaze, letting the silence stretch until it was a taut, vibrating wire. And in that quiet, heavy space, as the whole cafe watched, she slowly, deliberately placed her hand in his. The judgment didn't matter. The whispers were just noise. It's the only thing that mattered was the story they would never tell, the one that began not with money or lust, but with the dead. A year earlier, Ilara's world had ended in the sterile, fluorescent quiet of a hospital waiting room. The doctor's words were a muffled drone, a meaningless series of sounds that failed to penetrate the fog of her shock. Fentanyl, accidental overdose. So sorry for your loss, Liam. Her little brother. 17, the guilt was a physical thing. A living creature with claws and teeth that had taken up residence in her chest. She had been the one who was supposed to be there. She had promised her parents she would stay with him while they were away for the weekend, their first real vacation in a decade. But she had a rehearsal, a stupid, unimportant rehearsal, with the university quartet. She'd told him she'd be back by 10. She'd turned her phone on silent so she wouldn't be distracted. By the time she got home, past midnight, the paramedics were already there. Their movements efficient and impersonal as they worked on his still form on the living room floor. She never touched her cello again. The instrument, once an extension of her own body, now felt like an accusation. Its polished wood and elegant curves mocked her from its stand in the corner of her room. The music that had once been her sanctuary was now just the soundtrack to her failure. Her parents, lost in their own grief, looked at her with a new, unbearable distance in their eyes. They didn't blame her, not out loud. They didn't have to. She saw it every time she entered a room, the slight flinch, the way her mother's smile never quite reached her eyes. She was a ghost in her own home, a walking reminder of their stolen son. She had to get out. She had to run so far and so fast that the guilt couldn't keep up. The advertisement was a tiny, cryptic notice buried in the back pages of an international arts journal. Musical companions sought. Live in position on remote private island. Advanced proficiency on a string instrument required. Discretion and solitude essential. Generous stipend. Inquire via post office box. It sounded like the beginning of a gothic horror novel. It sounded like salvation. She poured every ounce of her remaining self into the application letter. She didn't write about her grief or her guilt. She wrote about Bach and Shostakovich. She wrote about the resonant frequency of spruce wood and the precise weight of a tort bough. She wrote about music as the only language that had ever made sense to her. She sealed the letter and sent it off to a post office box in a town she'd never heard of. A desperate message in a bottle cast into an unknown sea. She didn't expect a reply. When a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived 2 weeks later, bearing a handwritten address and a wax seal, her heart hammered against her ribs. Inside was a one-way ferry ticket and a simple, beat instruction, be at the dock Friday. 8 a.m., you will be met. The island was a slash of granite and wind-battered pine. Rising from a churning gray sea, it was more menacing than beautiful. A fortress against the world. A silent, grim-faced man named Tomas met her at the ferry, loaded her single suitcase into a battered Land Rover, and drove her up a winding, unpaved road without a word. They passed no other cars, no other houses. The house, when it came into view, was a shock. It wasn't a quaint island cottage. It was a modernist masterpiece of glass and stone, cantilevered over a cliff edge, its vast windows staring out at the angry ocean like unblinking eyes. It was magnificent and terrible all. At once, Tomas led her inside. The interior was a study in contrasts. The architecture was stark and minimalist, but the space was filled with a suffocating, feminine presence. Lush velvet curtains, antique chaise longues, and everywhere, portraits of the same woman. A woman with fiery red hair, a pale, ethereal face, and eyes that seemed to hold a tragic secret. She was painted, she was photographed, she was sculpted in bronze. It was a shrine. A mausoleum. Arthur waiting for her in the main living area. Cavernous room with a 20-foot-high ceiling and a wall of glass that made you feel as if you were about to be consumed by the sky and the sea. He was tall, gaunt, with a mane of white hair that fell over his forehead. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater and gray trousers, his feet bare on the cold stone floor. He looked less like a man and more like a figure from an old legend, a king in exile. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "I am Arthur Albright." The name struck her like a physical blow. Arthur Albright, the brilliant, iconoclastic composer. The man who had set the musical world on fire 2 decades ago, with his radical, emotionally raw symphonies, only to vanish completely after the scandal. The scandal involving his wife, the famous soprano, Lyra. The woman in the portraits? Her death had been ruled a suicide, but the rumors had been vicious. A whirlwind of whispers about creative jealousy, affairs, and emotional cruelty. The scandal had shattered his career and driven him into silence. You're Arthur Albright." She stammered, feeling foolish and small. "I was," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Now I am merely the caretaker of this museum." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the portraits, at the suffocating memory of his dead wife. He walked over to a closed door and opened it. The room inside was a music studio. In the center, illuminated by a single spotlight, was a cello. It was old, its wood the color of dark, rich honey. This was hers, Arthur said, his voice softening. She was a cellist before she was a singer, a brilliant one. It's better than I am a composer. Alara felt a chill crawl up her spine. In working on one last piece, he continued, his back still to her, a requiem for her, but I cannot finish it.
What?
The cello part. It is the heart of the piece. It is her voice. And I can no longer hear it. My own hands, he held them up, showing the swollen knuckles are traitors. He finally turned to face her. His pale blue eyes, ancient and filled with a pain so profound it felt like a gravitational pull locked onto hers. Your letter, he said. You write about music as if it is a living thing, as if it has a soul. That is how she felt. He took a step closer. The air grew thick, charged with the ozone of his grief. I don't need a companion, Miss Vance. I need a ghost. I need you to play this cello. I need you to study her diaries, her letters, her recordings. I need you to understand how she breathed, how she thought, how she translated sorrow into sound. I need you to become her hands, so that I can hear her voice one last time and finish this requiem. Alara stood frozen, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. This was not a job. This was an act of possession. It was a descent into a dead woman's life, orchestrated by her grieving, obsessive husband. It was madness. It was taboo. It was the most terrifying and seductive thing she had ever heard, to lose herself in the life of another woman, to be consumed by a different sorrow, a grander, more romantic tragedy than her own sordid, shameful guilt. To be someone else, anyone else. Other than the girl whose brother was dead because she'd gone to a rehearsal, the thought was a dark, irresistible poison. She looked from Arthur's haunted face to the cello waiting in the other room. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. Okay, she whispered, the word feeling both like a surrender and a salvation. I'll do it. The days that followed bled into one another, a seamless, hypnotic blur of music and memory. The island operated outside of time, governed only by the shifting tides and the moods of the sky. Lore's old life, the city, her parents, the ghost of her brother, all of it receded, becoming a distant, half-forgotten dream. Her new reality was the house, the sea, the music. And Arthur, her bedroom was in a separate wing of the house, but she spent most of her waking hours in Lyra's world. Arthur gave her a key to a locked room that had been Lyra's private study. It was just as she had left it. A scent of old paper and dried lavender hung in the air. Stacks of leather-bound diaries filled a bookshelf, their pages covered in a swirling, passionate script. Dresses, silk and velvet, still hung in the closet. Alara would run her hands over the fabric, imagining the woman who wore them. At first it felt like a violation, grotesque invasion of privacy. She would read Lyra's diaries with a sense of clinical detachment. Searching for musical insights, for clues to the woman's technique, Lyra wrote of her frustrations with a particular passage, her joy at mastering a difficult arpeggio. Intertwined with the music was the raw, unfiltered story of her life, her turbulent love for Arthur, her fears, her secrets. Arthur is a tempest, one entry read. He creates worlds with his music, but he lays waste to the world around him. To love him is to stand willingly in the heart of a hurricane. Alara started to play Lyra's cello. The instrument felt alien in her hands at first, its weight and balance different from her own. But as she played, as she immersed herself in Lyra's sheet music, annotated with her own frantic scribbles, something began to shift. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was channeling the emotion behind them. Her bow strokes became bolder. Her vibrato, more passionate, tinged with a melancholy she recognized as her own. Arthur would sit in a chair in the corner of the studio for hours. His eyes closed, listening. He rarely spoke. He would simply nod, or occasionally a single tear would trace a path through the weathered landscape of his face. His silence was more profound than any praise. It was a communion. He was hearing his wife, and Alara, for the first time in a year, was finding a way to make sound without being crushed by the weight of her own silence. The moral lines, so clear at the beginning, began to dissolve like salt in water. Was this a sick pantomime or a sacred ritual? Was she an employee or a medium? The guilt over her brother hadn't vanished, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer a sharp, stabbing pain, but a dull, constant ache, a bass note over which the new, soaring melody of Lyra's life was being written. She was using Lyra's sorrow to mute her own. The temptation to blur the lines further was a slow, creeping tide. One evening, as a storm raged outside, battering the glass walls of the house, Arthur came to her with a piece of sheet music. It was a section of the Requiem, the cello part a frantic, desperate lament. "I can't get this right," he said, his voice ragged. "It needs a certain kind of fury, a fury born of betrayal." He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't seem to be looking through her to the ghost of his wife. He seemed to see her as the broken girl underneath. "She found something out," he said softly, "something that broke her. I never knew what it was. She locked it away. I can hear the pain in the music she wrote afterward, but I can't decipher it." He handed her one of Lyra's diaries, open to a specific page. "He is not the boy I raised," Lyra had written. "He is a stranger with my son's face. What he has done, it is a darkness that will consume us all." "Play it for me, Alara," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. "Play the betrayal." Alara looked down at the diary, then at the music. Her own feelings of betrayal, at herself, at the world, at the cruel randomness of fate that had taken. Her brother surged within her. She picked up the bow, and she played. She poured all of her guilt, her rage, her grief into the strings. The sound that emerged was raw, violent, and exquisitely painful. It was the sound of a heart being torn in two when she finished. Breathless, the studio was utterly silent except for the howling of the wind. Arthur was standing over her, his hand hovering in the air above her shoulder. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of awe and sorrow. "Lyra," he whispered. The name slipped out, an unconscious reflex, and Alara, her soul scraped raw, her body thrumming with the ghost of the music, didn't correct him. She leaned into the name, into the identity. In that moment, she wanted to be Lyra. She wanted to have this grand, epic tragedy, this brilliant, tempestuous husband. She wanted to be a woman whose pain could be transformed into transcendent art, not a girl whose carelessness had led to a squalid, lonely death. She looked up at him, her eyes mirroring his own pain. "Tell me what to play next, Arthur," she said, her voice a low thrum. That was the moment the last line was crossed. It wasn't a physical transgression, but something far more intimate, more dangerous. They had stepped together into a shared delusion, a folie à deux, where grief and guilt and music and memory were tangled into an inseparable knot. He gave her a purpose, and she gave him his ghost back. The Requiem was no longer just his project. It was theirs. It was the only thing holding both of them together. The routine became their religion. Mornings were for the diaries, afternoons for the cello, evenings for listening to old recordings. Arthur providing commentary, dissecting every nuance of Lyra's phrasing. He started calling her Lyra more often, sometimes catching himself, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, but increasingly he let it be. And Alara let him. She started dressing in Lyra's clothes, not the grand gowns, but the simple cashmere sweaters and silk blouses she had worn around the house. They fit her perfectly. She would tie her own brown hair back in the same style Lyra had worn her red locks. She was an actress who had become so immersed in her role, she had forgotten where the stage ended and her life began. Their intimacy was profound, yet entirely chaste. The air between them crackled with an energy that was more elemental than sexual. It was the fierce, desperate bond of two drowning people clinging to the same piece of wreckage. He would rest his hand on her shoulder as she played, not a lover's caress, but a composer's touch, feeling the vibrations of the music through her bones as if she were the instrument itself. She would read him passages from the diaries, her voice taking on Lyra's inflections, and he would close his eyes, lost in the memory. They were creating a hermetically sealed world, a fragile bubble of music and madness that kept the real world, the world of death and consequences, at bay. The Requiem was growing, evolving, becoming a monumental work of staggering power and sorrow. Ilara could feel her own grief, her own story, weaving itself into the fabric of Lyra's. The music was becoming her confession, her penance. It was a terrifying, exhilarating process. She was both losing herself and finding herself in its pages, but the real world could not be held back forever. It arrived on the 10 a.m. ferry on a deceptively bright Tuesday morning. It arrived in the form of a man with Lyra's eyes and a cold, tight smile. "Hello, Father," he said, stepping into the great room and letting his gaze sweep over the scene with undisguised contempt. He looked at Ilara, standing by the piano in one of Lyra's sweaters, and his smile curdled into a sneer. "And you must be the new acquisition." It was Julian, Arthur's estranged son, the son Lyra had written about with such fear in her diaries. He was handsome, slick, radiating an aura of boardroom ruthlessness that felt utterly alien in the house of grief. Arthur stiffened, the fragile peace of the morning shattering. "Julian, what are you doing here?" "Checking in on my inheritance," Julian said breezily, running a finger along a dusty picture frame. "And from the looks of it, my father's sanity." "What is this? Some kind of sick cosplay, you find? A broken little girl from the mainland and dress her up in my mother's clothes?" He directed the question at Ilara, his eyes cold and appraising. "How much is he paying you to participate in this performance art?" "Get out, Julian," Arthur said, his voice a low growl. "Oh, I don't think so," Julian shot back, his bonhomie evaporating. "I've been hearing things. The lawyers are concerned. They're saying you're unstable. You're squandering the estate on this obsession." He gestured around the room. "Now I see it for myself. You're not just grieving, Father. You're decomposing. You're dragging this poor girl down with you." He took a step towards Ilara. "He's a black hole. He destroyed my mother, and he'll destroy you too. Get out while you still can." "She's not going anywhere," Arthur roared, taking a protective step in front of Ilara. "She is helping me with the music, something you would never understand." "The music?" Julian laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You mean that monstrosity you've been scribbling for years? That funeral dirge for a woman you drove to her death? It's over, Dad. I'm here to put a stop to this. I've spoken with the attorneys. We're filing for conservatorship. We're going to have you declared mentally incompetent. For your own good, of course." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. He staggered back, his hand clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Requiem.
Oh.
The threat wasn't just about money or control. It was about the music.
Oh.
If Julian took over, he would stop it.
Oh.
He would silence Lyra's final song. The thought was more terrifying to Arthur than death itself. Ilara watched the scene unfold, cold dread seeping into her bones. Julian wasn't just a concerned son. There was a venom in him, a cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he watched his father crumble. He was the darkness Lyra had written about. He was the reason for the fury in the music. Arthur collapsed into a chair, his face ashen, his body trembling. No, the music. "It has to be finished," he mumbled, his eyes wide with panic. Julian watched him with cold detachment. "It's for the best, Father. We'll get you help. Sell this place. Move you somewhere. Quiet." The threat was clear. He would erase this entire world, this sanctuary, this fragile, shared delusion, in that moment. Something inside Ilara snapped. All the guilt she had suppressed, all the rage she had channeled into the cello, coalesced into a single, sharp point. Of icy clarity, she looked at Arthur, so broken and helpless, and then at Julian, so smug and predatory. This wasn't about protecting a sick fantasy anymore. It was about protecting a man from his own son. It was about finishing the music that had become her own reason for living. It was about survival. She thought of the diaries. She had read them. Every page, every secret. She knew things about Julian, things Lyra had discovered and recorded in a panic. Things hidden in the later volumes that she had never discussed with Arthur. A secret so dark and shameful it could destroy a man's life. She had a choice. She could let it happen. She could let the real world rush in and shatter their fragile peace. She could pack her bag, take the ferry back to her old life, and leave Arthur to his fate. It would be the right thing to do, the moral thing to do. Or she could fight. She could use the weapon Lyra had left behind. She could become the monster Julian accused her of being, in order to save the man he was trying to destroy. The line between redemption and ruin was right in front of her. She took a deep breath, the decision hardening inside her like steel. She would not let him win. She would sacrifice what was left of her own moral compass to protect their sanctuary. She walked calmly over to Lyra's locked study. Her hand didn't tremble as she inserted the key. She went straight to the shelf, took down the last diary, and returned to the living room. Julian watched her, a curious, mocking smile on his face. Arthur was still slumped in his chair, whispering Lyra's name like a prayer. Ilara opened the diary. She didn't have to search for the page. She knew it by heart. "Julian," she said, her voice steady and cold, devoid of the emotion that had choked her just moments before. "I think you should leave now." "And why would I do that?" he scoffed. "Because Lyra was a very meticulous diarist," Ilara said, her eyes locked on his. She let the silence hang for a beat before she delivered the fatal blow. She wrote all about her trip to Amsterdam, about the boy, the one who ended up in the canal. She wrote about the money you took from your university trust to pay for the silence. Money you told her was for a semester abroad. Julian's face went white. The slick, confident mask dissolved, revealing the terrified boy underneath. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, sickly yellow. "You're lying," he hissed, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Ilara said, her voice soft, lethal. She wrote down the name of the family, the dates, account numbers from which the money was transferred. She even kept the news clipping. It's all here. She was heartbroken. She said the darkness in you would consume you all. "I think if this were to find its way to the right people, say the Dutch authorities or maybe your firm's board of directors, it might be very bad for business." It was a calculated, brutal act of cruelty. She was using a mother's private agony as a weapon. She was taking the secret that had likely contributed to Lyra's suicide and twisting it into a tool of blackmail. It was unforgivable, and in that moment it felt utterly, terrifyingly justified. Julian stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently. The bravado, the power, it was all gone. He was just a spoiled, frightened man caught in the glare of his own sordid past. He looked from Ilara's cold, unwavering gaze to his father, who was now watching the scene with a dawning, horrified understanding. Without another word, Julian turned and walked out of the house. A few moments later, they heard the sound of the Land Rover's engine roaring to life, then fading into the distance as he sped away. Back to the ferry, back to the world he belonged to. The silence he left behind was immense, heavy with the weight of what she had just done. Lara stood in the center of the room, the diary still open in her hands. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean. She had saved him. She had saved the music. But she had destroyed something inside herself to do. It. Bard Arthur slowly got to his feet. He walked over to her, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, gratitude, and a profound, aching sorrow. He looked at the diary in her hands, then into her eyes. "What have we become?" he whispered, and the question hung between them unanswered, in the vast, silent house by the sea. The move to Paris was Arthur's idea. After Julian's retreat, a strange, grim determination had settled over them. He worked feverishly, obsessively, and within 2 months, the Requiem was finished. It was a masterpiece, a shattering, monumental work of art that contained all their shared grief, madness, and devotion. But the island had become a prison. The memory of her choice, the ghost of her unforgivable act, lingered in every room. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. Paris was supposed to be an escape, a place to be anonymous. But Arthur, Albright's reemergence from a 20-year silence, the finished masterpiece, and a mysterious young woman by his side, was a story too delicious for the world to ignore. They weren't anonymous. They were a spectacle. The whispers followed them everywhere. Cradle robber, Svengali, victim. The confrontation in the cafe was just the latest, most public humiliation. After the girl and her friends had left, a cloud of awkward silence descending on the other patrons. Alara and Arthur sat without moving, their hands still clasped on the table, a fragile bridge in a hostile world. That night, back in the sprawling, elegant apartment Arthur had rented near the Jardin du Luxembourg, an apartment that felt as much like a gilded cage as the island had, Ilara found him staring at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of a young, smiling Liam, taken the summer before he died. Ilara had brought it with her from home, the only piece of her old life she hadn't been able to leave behind. "You should tell them," Arthur said softly, not turning around. "You should tell them the truth, Ilara, not their version of the truth. Ours." "No one would believe it," she whispered, her voice thick. "It's too messy." "The truth often is," he said, finally turning to face her. "Let me call that journalist from Le Monde, the one who has been so persistent. Tell her your story, the real one." And so, 2 days later, Ilara found herself sitting across from a sharp, intelligent woman named Isabel, a tape recorder resting between them on a polished mahogany table. Isabel's eyes were full of a practiced, professional sympathy, but underneath, Ilara could see the hunger for the scoop, the salacious details of a May-December affair gone wrong. Everyone expected a story of coercion and manipulation. Kayla was about to give them something far more unsettling. "People think they know our story," Kayla began, her voice quiet but steady. "They see a 23-year-old woman and a 63-year-old man, and they write the script themselves. They see a vulnerable girl and a wealthy, powerful man, a victim and a predator." She paused, taking a sip of water. "Hey, they're wrong. This was never about love or money. It was about justice. It started long before I ever met Arthur." She told Isabel everything. She started with Liam, not the sanitized version, but the raw, ugly truth. His gambling debts, the menacing phone calls, the fear in his eyes he tried so hard to hide. She confessed her own guilt, the crushing weight of knowing she had failed to protect him from the darkness that was closing in. "When I went to that island," she explained, "I wasn't looking for a sugar daddy. I was looking for a place to disappear. A place where I could forget that I was the girl whose brother died because of his debts to very dangerous people." Then she moved to Lyra. She described the diaries, the house that was a shrine, the oppressive grief. But then the story took a turn Isabel didn't expect. "Everyone assumes Arthur drove his wife to suicide," Ilara said. "The truth is, he spent the last 20 years blaming himself for something he didn't do, and Lyra didn't kill herself because Arthur was a monster. She killed herself because their son was." Isabel's pen froze above her notepad. Ilara laid it all out. The story from the diaries, Julian's sociopathic tendencies, his cruelty, his secrets. But she went further than what she had told Julian. It wasn't just about a dead boy in Amsterdam, Ilara said, her voice dropping. That was just the beginning. Julian was using his father's estate, his international accounts, his entire corporate structure as a front. He was laundering money for the same kind of people my brother got involved with, a transnational crime syndicate. Lyra found out. She confronted him and he threatened her. She realized he was too far gone, that he was a danger to everyone. So she started to gather evidence. This was the twist. The truth that reframed everything. The Requiem, Ilara leaned forward, her eyes intense. It wasn't just a piece of music. It was a key. Lyra was a genius, not just with music, but with patterns, with mathematics. She encoded the evidence account numbers, names, transaction dates, since it's a cello line of the Requiem. She created a musical cipher. It was her last desperate act, a message in a bottle that only one person could decode. A musician brilliant enough and intimate enough with her style to understand the patterns. She knew Arthur would spend the rest of his life trying to finish it, and she hoped that in doing so he would find her message. But he couldn't, Isabel whispered, finally understanding. His hands were arthritic, and his grief was too profound. He couldn't see the forest for the trees. He just heard the sorrow. He knew something was hidden in the music, a fury he couldn't understand, but he didn't know what it was. He thought he was hiring a musical companion, a medium to channel his wife's spirit. He didn't realize he was actually hiring a cryptographer. The role-playing, the clothes, the diary-set wasn't a sick obsession to resurrect a dead wife. It was a desperate, unconventional method. Arthur had to immerse Alara in Lyra's mind, her technique, her entire being, so she could play the music exactly as Lyra intended, unlocking the patterns hidden within the notes and the blackmail. Isabel asked, her voice hushed with, "Do, Julian." The secret about Amsterdam was just to get him off the island, to buy us time to finish the work, Alara admitted. The real evidence. The proof of the money laundering that linked directly back to the people responsible for my brother's death was in the music. We finished the Requiem. We decoded it. We sent the complete file to Interpol 3 weeks. Go. The whole story was laid bare. Their relationship wasn't a romance. It was a mission. A strange, desperate alliance between two broken people, bound by grief and a shared enemy. They had used each other, yes. He had used her talent and her emotional vulnerability. She had used his sanctuary in his quest to find her own form of absolution. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pure. But it was the truth. The aftermath was a media explosion. The arrest of Julian Albright and his associates was headline news across Europe. The story of the Requiem cipher was a sensation, a bizarre, brilliant tale of espionage and art. Arthur was vindicated. Transformed overnight from a tragic recluse into a heroic figure. But the judgment on them, on him and Alara, never really stopped. It just changed its form. They were no longer a scandal. They were a curiosity. A puzzle to be dissected on talk shows and in magazine articles. Was their bond real? Was it love? Was it a form of shared trauma? The world, even with the truth, couldn't accept the ambiguity. They needed to put them in a box to label their relationship. They were free, but they were more isolated than ever. Trapped together in the strange truth of their story. The final image, the one that would stay, with anyone who tried to understand them, was not one of triumph. It was of them weeks later, sitting in the Paris apartment. The Requiem was playing softly on the stereo, its soaring, sorrowful notes filling the vast, empty spaces of the room. There were no reporters, no police, no more threats. There was only the music and the silence that followed it. Alara looked at Arthur, at his old, tired face, and saw not a lover, not a father figure, not a savior. She saw her partner, her co-conspirator, the only other person on earth who knew the precise cost of the music that was now washing over them. He met her gaze, and his pale blue eyes held the same complex, unreadable expression she knew was in her own. The world called it a scandal. Then they called it a masterpiece. Alara looked at the man beside her, the one who had shared her strange, terrible journey from guilt to a freedom that felt a lot like exile. We called it survival, she thought. The music was the only part that was ever really true. She still didn't know if it had saved them or simply given them a more beautiful cage.